In this video, I'm going over my post-hike gear from my Sierra trip. We hiked 400 plus miles through the High Sierra on the Kings Canyon High Basin route, the High Sierra Trail, the Southern Sierra High Route, and the Sierra High Route itself. The gear that I took on this trip worked out really well. I released a full video before the trip of everything that I took. In this video, I'm just going over what worked, what didn't, and some of my favourite pieces of gear from the trip. So the only major thing that really changed for me on the hike was my shelter system. I started out with the Enlightened Equipment bivvy and the Gossamer Gear twin tarp. I wanted to go light on this trip and save as much weight as possible. But the first week or 10 days of the trip on the KCHBR, we were dealing with a lot of bugs. So although at night when I actually wanted to go to sleep, the Recon bivvy kept the bugs away, the bugs were so bad that it was pretty miserable to be around camp. So for example, we would hike all day, roll into camp, set up our shelters, and the other guys would get inside their fully enclosed tents and eat their dinner and kind of hang out and be able to relax inside their shelters. Whereas with me, with the bivvy, obviously I couldn't eat from inside it. I had to kind of sit around with my bug net down over my head, trying to eat underneath the bug net, which was kind of miserable. Otherwise, the shelter system itself is great. It is super light. I was completely protected from the bugs when I was actually sleeping, but it was just, I really wanted to have somewhere to escape away from those mosquitoes. So then I moved over to the Gossamer Gear, the One. It's a fully enclosed single wall shelter that I've used before on multiple trips. Obviously the weight of my pack went up a little bit, the bulk it went up a little bit as well, but it was well worth it. By the time I actually got the one sent out to me on trail, the bugs had calmed down a good bit because the temperatures had dropped quite a bit. But I was honestly really happy to have a fully enclosed tent with me because obviously a fully enclosed tent is a little bit warmer than a tarp setup. So I carried that for the rest of the trail, super happy with it. Then I want to highlight quickly my sleep system. I took out the Thermarest Hyperion 20 degree sleeping bag, which was a fairly recent addition to Thermarest's quilt and sleeping bag selection. But with 20 degrees being the kind of comfort rating, I wanted to take a really warm sleeping bag, sleeping pad. So I decided to take the Thermarest Neo Air X Therm with me, as opposed to the X Lite. It's a few ounces heavier, and it is a little bit more bulky than the X Lite, but I had zero regrets carrying it with me on this trip. I didn't need it in the first sort of 10 days or 2 weeks of the trip, but once those temperatures did drop down, it was really nice to have a sleeping pad with a really high R value. I did also bring my silk sleeping bag liner, which is made by Rab. That does add about 5 or 6 ounces to the overall weight of the shelter, the sleep system. But again, totally worth it. It helped to keep me warm on the coldest nights. And it did kind of keep all of my sweat and grime that you build up through the day of hiking off the sleeping bag itself, and I was able to just wash that in town, freshen it up, and then get back out on the trail. So I wanted to highlight my sleep system because it kept me warm even on the coldest of nights. We had several nights that were well below freezing, and a few situations where we had really bad frost from condensation on the sleeping bag. But I was nice and toasty inside, and never was so cold out on the trip that I couldn't sleep. The pack that I used on this trip was the Gossamer Gear Gorilla, which is a 40-litre backpack with a fully supportive frame and hip belt. The pack did really well. The capacity was just about right, even with a fully loaded bear canister, all of my equipment, and about 6 days of food. It did handle that pretty well. It was maxed out several times on the trip, but there was enough capacity for me to carry everything I needed to with me. The only problem that I did have with the pack is that the water bottle pockets, they actually tore in a couple of spots. They were still functional, but with the Sierras, with the routes that we were doing, a lot of that was off trail, scrambling over talus and granite rocks. And that granite is super abrasive. So if I was having to sit down on a rock and slide or kind of navigate my way through a talus field, that granite was abrading the water bottle pockets on the pack. On one side I was carrying my water bottles where it didn't get abraded quite so much, but on this one it got torn up pretty badly because I had a tripod in there. And so every time I would like kind of hit a rock, it would kind of hit on the sharp edges of the tripod on the inside of the water bottle pocket, and it tore it up pretty good. They were still fully functioning by the end of the trip, but they've got pretty decent holes in now. If I was to do a trip like this again through the Sierras, I'd probably use Gossamer Gear's Silverback, which is more catered for off-trail travel. But for most trips, this pack is going to be absolutely fine. For something like the PCT, no problems at all. You're not dealing with the same level of scrambling. Of course, in the Sierras you are a little bit, but the Sierras, specifically the PCT through the Sierras versus what we were doing through the Sierras is very different. You can't really compare the JMT and the PCT through the Sierras to what we were doing. They're not the same experience. That doesn't have the same kind of abusive impact on the gear and also the body that the hybrids do. Next piece of gear I wanted to highlight, talk about my clothing just briefly. I do have a completely separate video on all the clothing that I use for the trip. My clothing system worked out really well. The one thing I would have changed is right at the start of our trip on the Kings Canyon High Basin route, there was a lot of bushwhacking. So we were basically having to bushwhack through really dense brush, manzanita and thorns. And I was doing it in short running shorts, which was a mistake. I should have had a pair of solid hiking pants because both mine and Cheesebeard's legs got really chewed up, scratched. We got scratches on top of scratches to the point that we were bleeding, and the adrenaline of just, it was like death from 1,000 paper cuts because you're just getting scratches on top of scratches to the point that at the end of the day, like all of the adrenaline was gone because of the pain. And obviously hiking really hard miles as well. So I would definitely add in a pair of pants for the Kings Canyon High Basin route, but for the rest of the routes that we did, you wouldn't really need pants. So I would have just used those for the first sort of 10 days or so and then sent them home. Other things about my clothing, a new piece of gear for me for this trip was the Rab Proton puffy jacket. I do have a separate video all about puffy jackets, you know, the argument between synthetic and down. But I just wanted to say that it was a really good piece of gear for me. It kept me really warm. I wore it a lot because towards the end of the trip we got really cold temperatures. So as soon as I would get to camp, I would throw that on. It kept me warm. I slept in it on most nights at the end of that trip, and I'll be continuing to use it going forward. My rain gear was the Z-Packs rain gear. Although we didn't deal with a lot of rain on the trip, we had maybe 2 or 3 days with actually any serious rain. I was wearing it quite a lot because of the temperatures and because of very cold winds. So the matching rain pants and jacket served me really well. They're extremely lightweight. They are pretty breathable, especially with the underarm zippers. But the thing that I was surprised about was how durable they actually are. They're extremely lightweight, and when you actually feel the material, it feels kind of similar to frog togs. It feels like it's going to get torn quite easily. But I had zero issues with it. I wore it almost every day at some point on the trip, and it's still going really strong. So I'll continue to use this also going forward. Next up, my cooking gear. I actually ended up cold soaking for probably the first 2 weeks of the trip, and I actually quite enjoyed it. I'd tried cold soaking before, hated it, but on this trip again at the start I was trying to go really light, so I cold soaked. I ended up eating a lot of ramen bombs, and couscous became one of my favourite kind of cold soak meals. But then as the trip went on, when those temperatures dropped, I got my stove sent out to me, and I'm really glad I did. It was super nice to have hot food with me out on the trail. The stove was the MSR Pocket Rocket Deluxe, which is slightly heavier, but it has a few more features than the Pocket Rocket 2. Specifically, it's more capable at dealing with colder temperatures or wind, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's worth the extra weight. And then I think this is about a 700 milliliter MSR Titan kettle with the homemade koozie. I do have a separate video on this as well, but I loved it. Obviously, it added a little bit of weight in my pack over just going stoveless, but it was just totally worth it to have hot food and hot coffee on those cold mornings and those cold nights towards the end of the trip. And then the last thing to mention, I think in the original gear video, I talked about this tripod. This is the Manfrotto tripod. It's really great, super solid, and it holds my big Sony a7R II. But I ditched this and I ended up carrying basically a full-size tripod on this trip. It's the Mi Photo Backpacker, I believe is the name of the tripod. I removed a couple of the leg sections, so it made it so that the tripod was about head height when I'm sitting down, like cross-legged as I am now. But it just enabled me to get shots that I would not have been able to capture with this. As you may know, I shot a documentary on this trip, a documentary of the Sierra, which I'm in the process of editing, which should be released probably in the springtime. But that tripod just enabled me to capture it enabled me to capture shots that I just wouldn't have been able to get with this little tripod, especially when I was sitting down and interviewing people that were involved in the Sierras. Just having that kind of almost a full-size tripod was really invaluable. I think the camera gear on this trip was well over 6 pounds. I think my base weight for the trip was probably around 22 pounds, and that's without food and water. So for me, that's a pretty high base weight. But the stuff I had with me enabled me to do what I wanted to do in the Sierra. So it was a lightweight setup, but not as lightweight as it could be for a lot of other people. One other thing that did happen on the trip is that my Sony a7R II had a pretty major fail. The rear buttons on the camera basically stopped working entirely. I couldn't control ISO. I couldn't access the menu. I could control my aperture and my shutter speed with the dials. I could shoot video and I could shoot photography, but I had very limited control over my camera. So apart from that camera fail, everything worked out really well for me on the trail. If you have any questions about the gear here or the gear in that original video or about the trip themselves, then drop them in the comments below. I really hope you guys found this video helpful. There's going to be a bunch of links in the description to my website for my trip report from the trip, as well as a comprehensive gear list on my website of all of the items that I took with me. So be sure to check those out. I'll catch you in the next one.